So I want you to imagine an underground, heavily persecuted group of people.
Oh, yeah.
Like, for generations, they have been actively hunted. They hold these secret meetings in, dark, damp catacombs,
Yeah.
whispering so the imperial guards don't hear them. And then, practically overnight, the Emperor of Rome just hands them the keys to the entire empire. Because that is exactly what happened to Christianity after the Edict of Milan.
It really is one of the most abrupt and total reversals of fortune in human history. I mean, one day you are an outlaw, risking your life literally just to meet with your community. And the next, your faith is being elevated to the state religion of the most powerful empire on earth.
It's wild, and today's deep dive is an exploration of a fascinating historical analysis from a biblical humanities lecture that looks closely at this exact moment. We're exploring what actually happened when the church went from being the hunted to being the absolute ruler.
Yeah.
And the tease here is that instead of ushering in some utopian golden age, the source argues this sudden victory sparked a massive identity crisis.
A huge one.
Right. It led to a draconian lockdown of information and, incredibly, the accidental creation of the grandest architecture and music the world has ever seen, but for reasons that might completely surprise you.
And just to set the stage for you listening, we need to be clear that we are unpacking a very specific academic and historical analysis here. We aren't taking a theological stance or endorsing this particular view of church history. We are simply exploring a provocative, frankly fascinating argument made by the historian in our source material.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we have to look at the immediate aftermath of the Emperor Constantine making Christianity the accepted religion.
Right.
He essentially treated the church leaders, the bishops, like absolute VIPs. He brought them into the halls of power and basically said, well, all right, I want a Christian Roman Empire. Tell me how to run it.
And you would expect them to immediately start drafting laws,
Right.
or reshaping the economy, or rebuilding the social safety net based on their teachings.
You would think so.
But that isn't what happened. According to the analysis, the clergy spent the next several centuries entirely consumed by intense, highly complex doctrinal debates. They just argued over theology and creeds, like the Apostles' Creed.
It feels like a scrappy startup finally buying out a massive global conglomerate.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The CDO turns to the startup founders and says, okay, you're in charge. What's our global strategy? And instead of running the company, the board locks themselves in a conference room for 100 years to argue over the company mission statement.
Exactly.
But I have to push back a little here. Isn't getting the doctrine right a fundamental necessity?
Oh, sure.
So why is the analysis framing this as a squandered opportunity? I mean, why did it take centuries just to agree on a few paragraphs of a creed?
What's fascinating here is to understand that bottleneck, we really have to look at the cultural context of the Roman Empire at that exact moment. Because the empire surrounded the Mediterranean Sea, which meant it wasn't a monolith. It was a massive political boundary containing 5 major, highly distinct civilizations.
Wow, 5?
Yeah. You had the Egyptian, the Mesopotamian, the Hebraic, the Hellenistic, which is the Greek culture, and the Latin cultures, all under one umbrella.
Handing those 5 distinct cultures the exact same religious text sounds like, I don't know, handing 5 different musicians the exact same piece of sheet music.
Oh, absolutely.
Like one is a jazz musician, one plays classical, one plays heavy metal. Even if they're looking at the exact same notes, what comes out of their instruments is going to sound like chaos.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And on top of that cultural clash,
Yeah.
you have to factor in the prevailing religious mindset of the time, which was polytheism.
Right.
The source material makes a really crucial point here. The spread of Christianity during its first few centuries, like its initial bottom-up spread during a polytheistic era, was a historical miracle.
Because polytheistic cultures don't usually adopt new, exclusive religions from the ground up.
Well, more fundamentally than that, the concept of individual religious freedom simply did not exist.
Oh, wow.
You didn't wake up on a Tuesday and decide to change your personal religion. Religion was tied to your family, your tribe, your city, and your state.
It was baked in.
Right. The patriarch of the family decided the household gods. The emperor decided the state's gods. Religion was a strict societal obligation.
So the fact that this underground movement spread from person to person, completely against the grain of the entire societal structure, is what makes it an anomaly.
Precisely. The source contrasts this with how Buddhism spread, which was largely top-down.
Okay.
Kings and nobles adopted it because it helped consolidate power, and the people naturally followed their leaders.
Yeah.
But early Christianity spread from the bottom up under the constant threat of death.
Right.
But post-Constantine, that power dynamic completely flips. Now, they have ultimate authority. And suddenly, you have people from all five of those distinct civilizations flooding into the church.
Because it's the state religion now.
Exactly. And they are reading the exact same texts,
Yeah.
but filtering them through their own ancient mythologies and cultural lenses.
Can you give me an example of how that actually plays out? Like,
Yeah.
how does a cultural lens completely change the meaning of the text?
Yeah, let's look at the Hellenistic or Greek culture versus the Hebraic culture.
Okay.
If you were reading the text from a traditional Hebraic perspective, the physical world and the spiritual world are deeply intertwined. The body is a good thing, the physical creation is considered holy.
Got it.
But if you are a Greek reader, raised on the philosophy of Plato, you view the world through Hellenistic dualism.
Which means?
You believe the physical body is inherently corrupt or evil, and only the pure, invisible spirit is good. The physical world is basically a prison for the soul.
I see where this is going. If a Greek thinker and a Hebraic thinker both read a verse about the Word becoming flesh, the Hebraic reader sees a beautiful culmination of their faith.
Right.
While the Greek reader is deeply confused, because why would a perfect divine spirit willingly trap itself in evil physical flesh?
Exactly the kind of friction that occurred. And that resulted in what the church deemed an explosion of heresies.
Ah.
Every time the leadership tried to establish a baseline doctrine, a completely new interpretation would sprout up from a different corner of the empire.
Just driven by these deeply ingrained cultural differences.
Exactly. The leaders were caught in this endless, terrifying loop of trying to define the exact, precise nature of their theology just to keep the empire from fracturing.
Which brings us to their reaction, because if you are the leadership and you have this total chaos of interpretation threatening to tear apart the massive empire you just inherited, how do you fix it?
Well,
The answer, according to the source, is that they implemented a massive, truly draconian information lockdown.
a total restriction on the flow of religious information to the common people.
The details of this lockdown are genuinely shocking. The leaders banned the reading of the Bible by the everyday public. They outlawed individual interpretation.
Yeah.
They banned translating the texts into local native languages. They even purposefully destroyed Greek Bibles. And Greek was the common language of the Mediterranean.
It was basically the lingua franca.
It was the language most people actually understood. Instead, they forced the exclusive use of Latin for all texts and services.
And Latin was the language of the Roman bureaucracy. It was the language of the elite officials and administrators, not the everyday language of the diverse masses across the empire.
But how do you actually enforce a lockdown like that? We are talking about an ancient empire without the internet, without mass surveillance, and without a modern police force. How do they physically stop people from reading or translating a book?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you do it by controlling the supply chain of knowledge.
Okay.
Before the printing press, a book wasn't something you could just hide in your coat pocket.
Right.
A single copy of a text had to be painstakingly hand-copied in a scriptorium.
So it took forever.
It took months of labor and incredibly expensive materials, like parchment made from animal skins.
So the state simply monopolized the scriptoriums.
That's the mechanism.
Okay.
If you control the few places capable of producing books, you control the information. If someone was caught with an unauthorized Greek copy, it was confiscated and destroyed.
Wow.
The underlying logic here makes a brutal kind of sense from an administrator perspective. The leaders believed that if the common people were allowed to read the texts, their diverse cultural lenses would just invent more heresies.
And splinter their religion into 1,000 competing factions.
Exactly. Therefore, the ability for an individual to read and interpret the text was outlawed.
It is the ultimate form of gatekeeping. You just remove the source material from the public entirely.
And this specific reaction laid the very foundation for the papacy. It created a system where a single top-down authority dictates the one singular correct interpretation of the text.
Interesting.
It established an absolute rule of thought that remained largely unchallenged in the West until Martin Luther translated the Bible into German centuries later.
Because the average person was entirely reliant on the clergy to tell them what was true.
Right, because the text was literally locked behind a language barrier.
Which introduces a massive, glaring practical problem. If the religious services and the texts are all exclusively in Latin, and 80 to 90% of your audience doesn't speak a single word of Latin, church suddenly becomes incredibly mind-numbingly boring.
Oh, completely.
It's like being forced to sit through a 2-hour movie in a foreign language with no subtitles. How do you keep the audience from just walking out?
You can't keep them engaged with words they don't understand. If the intellect is locked out by the language barrier, you have to target the senses.
Okay.
According to the analysis, the church had to pivot from a hearing religion, one based on listening to and intellectually processing spoken teachings, into a seeing and feeling religion.
A completely sensory experience.
And this pivot is essentially the secret origin of European high culture.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Because they couldn't reach people through the spoken word, they had to reach them through awe, spectacle, and overwhelming emotion.
I find this part of the deep dive fascinating because it makes so many disparate pieces of history suddenly click together. Think about the visceral contrast here.
Right.
Imagine a believer whose grandparents worshipped in a literal catacomb. It was dark, it was completely silent, and the focus was entirely on the spoken message. Now, that same family walks into a towering basilica.
Huge difference.
The creation of grand church music wasn't just about art for art's sake. The source mentions how this era laid the groundwork for a tradition that would eventually produce composers like Mozart, Beethoven, and Handel.
Yeah, this entire tradition of sweeping, majestic music was engineered to make people feel the divine.
To physically feel the chords vibrating in their chests.
Exactly, without needing to understand a single Latin word being sung.
Yeah.
It was a brilliantly effective emotional bypass.
Yeah.
And it extended far beyond the music. Look at the architecture. Those sprawling European cathedrals that took hundreds of years to construct weren't just large meeting halls. They were meticulously calculated machines of awe.
The source highlights how builders studied the exact placement of stained glass windows to manipulate the sunlight at specific times of day.
Yeah, they were literally engineering light to create a supernatural, awe-inspiring mood inside the building. Every detail was designed to overwhelm.
You walk through the heavy wooden doors, the choir's voices echo off the vaulted stone ceilings, the engineered light hits the colored glass and beams down through the thick smoke of the incense.
You don't need a theology degree or a working knowledge of Latin to be brought to your knees by that atmosphere.
You also see the introduction of massive visual aids during this time. Elaborate statues of the saints, painted icons, statues of the Virgin Mary.
Well, if you cannot read the historical stories of the faith, you need physical heroes to look at. You need tangible touch points.
That makes sense.
The source even mentions this is where the tradition of taking on a saint's baptismal name comes from.
Oh, interesting.
It was a way for a person to tie themselves to a physical, visual representation of the faith when the text was inaccessible.
And the absolute climax of this sensory pivot was the transformation of the Eucharist, or communion. The service evolved to focus almost entirely on this physical, dramatic act.
Right. The theology developed that the bread and wine didn't just represent Jesus, but chemically transformed into his literal flesh and blood. The doctrine of transubstantiation.
Because if the words spoken at the altar are incomprehensible, the physical consumption of the divine becomes the main event.
Exactly. People could see the bread lifted up. They could smell the incense. They could taste the wine. They had a tangible physical experience to consume.
Which entirely replaced intellectual engagement with a text they couldn't read.
They built a spectacular sensory machine to keep the masses engaged. And for the vast majority of people, it worked perfectly. But the source material points out a fascinating demographic split here. The masses were largely just showing up because Christianity was now the mandatory state religion.
Right.
For the average citizen, it was just the new rule of the empire, and the beautiful cathedrals were a nice bonus.
Here's where it gets really interesting. What about the hardcore believers? The people whose parents and grandparents had literally sacrificed everything, sometimes their own lives, for this faith.
For that deeply devoted demographic, this new era of peace and sensory spectacle was actually a profound crisis.
A crisis.
Yeah. For over 200 years, the very core of Christian identity was sacrifice. To call yourself a believer meant you were willing to risk your property, your social standing, your freedom, and your life.
That constant looming threat of state-sponsored violence was the crucible that proved your devotion was real.
And suddenly the state isn't trying to kill you. The state is funding your choir. You're sitting in a beautiful, safe building, and the emperor is paying the bills.
When your entire community's identity is forged in persecution, peace feels like a loss of purpose. It begs the question, how do you prove your ultimate devotion to God when it costs you absolutely nothing to believe?
You have to manufacture the suffering yourself. The psychological need for identity-defining sacrifice was immense.
So what did they do?
The source illustrates this by telling the story of a young man named Anthony.
Okay.
Anthony was a wealthy young man living in Egypt shortly after this transition of power. He goes to a church service and hears the biblical story of Jesus telling a rich man to sell your possessions and give to the poor.
And Anthony takes it entirely literally. He actually does it.
He gives up his massive inheritance, ensures his sister is financially taken care of, and walks out into the harsh Egyptian desert. He decides to practice extreme asceticism.
He isolates himself completely.
Yeah.
The details of his life out there are wild. The source describes how he survived on a diet of basically just dried bread and salt water.
Just brutal conditions.
He spent his days in total isolation, weaving baskets, keeping bees to sustain his minimal needs, and intentionally enduring the harsh elements. He was actively punishing himself.
Because he was seeking a substitute for the persecution that had vanished? He was trying to prove to himself and to God that his faith was still worth giving up everything for, even if the Roman emperor wasn't demanding his life anymore.
The most surprising part of this isn't Anthony's individual choice, though. It's what happened next. This didn't stay a quirky, isolated incident of one guy roughing it in the desert.
No, not at all.
It spread like a plains fire.
People heard about Anthony's extreme lifestyle, and it resonated perfectly with that widespread crisis of purpose. Thousands of people looked at his suffering and thought, yes, that is real faith, not this comfortable, incense-filled cathedral stuff.
The psychological need to suffer for the faith was so strong that men and women started fleeing the cities in droves. They missed the clarity of persecution so much that they substituted it with self-inflicted denial.
And boom, you have the explosion of the monastic movement.
Wow.
It was a massive sociological shift. Entire communities formed in remote areas around the idea of rejecting the very world that had just embraced them.
This established the deep-rooted traditions of celibate priests, nuns, and isolated monasteries.
Exactly.
I have to jump in here and play devil's advocate because this is where the source's analysis really flips the conventional script.
Okay.
Aren't monks and these massive, beautiful European cathedrals usually considered the absolute pinnacle of Christian devotion?
Right, traditionally.
When people think of the glories of church history, they pictured the intricate, quiet monasteries and the towering, majestic spires. Why is the historian in our source material framing this era as a massive failure?
This raises an important question and brings us back to the cultural collision we discussed earlier. The source argues that this entire monastic movement, the idea of fleeing society to punish the body, was actually rooted in Hellenistic dualism.
Not the original teachings.
Not at all.
Right, that Greek philosophical idea that the physical world is inherently evil and you have to escape it to be spiritually pure.
Exactly. The source contends that punishing the physical body to elevate the spirit is fundamentally a Greek idea.
Okay.
The original biblical mandate, according to this analysis, was the exact opposite. It was to bring the kingdom of God into the physical world. The goal was to transform society, to care for the sick, to alleviate poverty, and to establish justice in the here and now.
When you frame it that way, it is a staggering missed opportunity. They had just been handed the keys to the Roman Empire.
The keys to the entire civilized world at the time.
Right. They had the resources, the immense political power, and the infrastructure to actually change the fabric of society for the better. They could have revolutionized the ancient world.
But instead, the movement fractured in two directions. And according to this critique, both completely missed the mark.
How so?
Well, the leadership, the clergy, hoarded the information. They locked the texts behind a language barrier and wasted their immense resources arguing over esoteric doctrinal nuances for centuries.
And the other side?
Meanwhile, the most devoted, hardcore believers, the laity, instead of acting as a moral engine to reform the empire's injustices, abandoned society altogether to live in isolated caves and remote monasteries.
They completely checked out.
Completely.
The empire was theirs to shape, and the leaders debated semantics while the most passionate believers hid in the desert.
It is a monumental tragedy when viewed through that lens. And the historian in the source material uses incredibly powerful, haunting imagery to describe this failure. The imagery of the crying stones.
I love this metaphor. Today, millions of tourists flock to Europe specifically to see the massive cathedrals.
Sure, they are beautiful.
They travel to Istanbul to marvel at the sheer scale of the walls of Constantinople. They visit the quiet, ancient remains of monasteries or even the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem from an earlier era. We view these structures as holy sites, as triumphs of human faith and architectural genius.
But this historical analysis views them completely differently. It views those structures as tragic monuments to a movement that fundamentally lost its way.
The stones are crying.
Exactly. Those beautiful towering stones aren't singing hymns of victory. They are crying out about the dangers of losing your true purpose. They stand as monuments to incredible human energy spent on the wrong things,
On sensory spectacle, rigid control, and societal isolation.
rather than the actual transformation of the world around them.
It is the ultimate cautionary tale. What happens when a grassroots movement achieves total, unquestioned victory, but completely forgets why it was fighting in the first place?
Yeah, they built spectacular, breathtaking buildings, but they failed to build the society they were supposedly called to create.
It perfectly illustrates how complex history is. The very things we often celebrate as the absolute pinnacle of a culture's achievement, the sweeping orchestral art, the breathtaking architecture, the extreme monastic devotion, can actually be symptoms of a deep, systemic failure to execute their primary mission.
What an incredible journey to think about.
We started with a persecuted underground group that suddenly gained ultimate, unimaginable power. And what did it lead to?
A cultural collision that paralyzed the leadership.
A deliberate information blackout that kept the masses in the dark.
The accidental invention of grand European art and architecture just to keep an audience engaged.
And a misguided retreat into the desert by the most passionate believers.
It forces you to look at those beautiful cathedrals in a completely different light.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We've talked a lot about ancient empires, scriptoriums, and theological debates, but the mechanics of this story feel incredibly relevant today.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the Constantinian information lockdown we just discussed. The leaders saw a chaotic clash of cultures and interpretations, so they bottlenecked the information. They took the texts away, forced a single language, and centralized all the authority to keep the peace.
They controlled the supply chain of knowledge to stop the splintering.
Exactly. Now look at our modern digital age. The internet has done the exact opposite. We have completely removed the bottleneck.
There are no scriptoriums controlling the flow of information anymore.
None. Everyone has access to everything, all the time, and anyone can broadcast their own interpretation of the truth to millions of people instantly. We shattered the lockdown.
We really did.
But look at the result. Are we not seeing the exact same explosion of cultural splintering and digital heresies that terrified those ancient leaders in the first place?
Great question.
Are we headed for a new era where society fractures into 1,000 competing realities simply because we removed the gatekeepers? It makes you wonder if those ancient Roman bishops, for all their flaws, understood something terrifying about human nature and information that we are just now having to relearn. Think about your own life, your career, or a movement you care about. We spend all our time fighting to achieve a goal, fighting to win. But if you finally get exactly what you've been fighting for, ultimate success, ultimate power, are you absolutely sure you won't forget what you actually wanted to do with it? Are you building something meaningful, or are you just stacking up beautiful stones that will eventually cry out?